Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe has urged Southern Africa to reduce its dependence on foreign aid. He was speaking at the 34th Southern African Development Conference Summit in Victoria Falls. He called for Southern African nations to make better use of their natural resources, such as minerals and land, rather than relying on aid packages from overseas. Well, Lizzette Robleto-Gonzalez is the policy manager at Progressio, an international development charity working for justice and the eradication of poverty. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. I mean, it's clearly not just as simple as that, is it, as saying we've got to rely more on our natural resources, which undoubtedly Africa is very rich in. How complicated is the picture, really?
Well, the picture is very complicated. We are talking about areas that still are developing, where the governance structures are still pretty weak, where the basic services may be lacking, and so therefore there is the need of having more accountability and more transparency. Natural resource exploitation is a very complex issue because of what it entails. You need good communication with your communities that would be potentially affected by the exploitation. You may need a certain level of consultation so that communities benefit from it. And, or you may need to do a proper assessment so that their environmental resources and the livelihoods of those communities are not affected directly.
Obviously, as we talked about, you know, Africa itself is very resource rich, but how great is the problem of companies from around the world coming in there and exploiting those resources without them actually really being able to be exploited by Africans themselves?
I think the risk is great. Obviously, we know there is well documentation about human rights abuses by companies operating in certain countries where there is no governance structures, there is no accountability, and the problems can go on and continue. And obviously, if this proposal is on the table, governments in Southern Africa need to bear in mind that the accountability levels and the kind of companies they are allowing into the country to exploit those resources have ethical values, have corporate social responsibilities in place in order for them to develop the natural resource exploitation in a fair, just and ethical manner.
You talk about good governance, the importance of that across Africa. It's a subject that came up at the African-US Summit in Washington about 10 days ago. All the leaders there talking about it, agreeing how transparency and good governance is important. Is that just words, though, do you think, or are we actually seeing real steps being made in Africa towards better governance?
I think with the adoption of what we call the Ruggie principles, human rights and the importance of keeping transparency within corporations and the responsibility of the states to respond to the behavior of companies has become more and more at the front of news. And I think there are certain avenues that can be exploited in order for communities, for NGOs, for other civil society organizations to ensure that they hold their government to account, including businesses. I think businesses, for many years, they've been trying to clear their act. And more consumers are playing a great role in ensuring that companies behave ethically.
Whatever the complications, though, do you have some sympathy with what Robert Mugabe is saying? Do you think that Southern Africa is too reliant on foreign aid?
I think it is important to differentiate between different types of aids. We have, of course, humanitarian relief that usually happens after a disaster, or whether it's social or environmental. But we also have the more longer-term development, which is what we're talking about. If that kind of development happened strategically, it could provide transformational support to communities that need it. But we are talking about countries as well that are still in a process of development. We, for example, support a small program on the ground where women had to walk for hours to get the water. We talk about safety for girls and women to access education, to access health services, to access justice. So there are all those provisions that need to be in place as well. And that's where aid can play a beneficial role, especially if the aid provides a skill share. Just to give you an example, Progressio is an organization that bases programs on a skill share. The idea is that we work ourselves out of a job, effectively. We transfer what we know to communities that will put it at good use, and they will eventually become autonomous, self-reliant. The work that we do is connected to the international arena, which provide a forum for the voices of the people that are usually unheard. If that aid, if that support is capitalized on, those skills will be beneficial for the communities and for the country as a whole.
Well, indeed, there's a saying, isn't there? Give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for life.
Indeed.
Do you think there are certain forms of foreign aid, however well meant then, that don't get to the core of the problem? They're just sort of a sticking plaster over the problem.
I think aid has to be pragmatic. We have to think that there will be an exit strategy, so as not to create that dependency. So you have to think responsibly about what kind of work you will be undertaking according to the context. So yes, absolutely. I think there is a lot of creativity that can go into aid and how programs are put together, good design programs, good help communities. It's when we are not fully appreciative of the context where the program is being delivered that we may lose the plot. But the idea of supporting community is there, and is working with them so that they can design jointly their programs based on their needs that will help you to achieve those goals.
What effect do you think that these comments by Robert Mugabe will have? Do you think it will affect the way Africa views its reliance on foreign aid?
I think the question on aid has been going around and has been, in people's minds for years. And I think this is, in a way, news, but in a way it's been discussed amongst NGOs, among member states, or the donor community. So the key is how to transition now, to make it so that, to make it effective, an effective transition, so that communities are not left isolated or vulnerable, especially when we talk about trade and we talk about investment, big foreign investment coming into a country that may or may not be ready.
And what role does the international community have to play in that?
I think the international community has a big role to play and a big responsibility, not just to ensure that businesses and corporations are behaving responsibly, but also that governments receive the support in order for them to fulfill their objectives. And of course, the role of NGOs is very important in that manner, because NGOs can serve as a bridge between the state and civil society, where bridges have been completely broken down as a result of conflict. And so I think it's a lot to think about, but I think that there's certainly the will to do so.
Of course, Robert Mugabe, in this instance, was talking about Southern Africa, but how similar is this pattern elsewhere in the world?
Well, let's look at Latin America. Latin America is full of rich natural resources, and at one point or another, somebody mentioned, oh, well, Latin America has been cursed rather than blessed by natural resources. And that is a reality. That could be a parallel. There are so many lessons that can be learned about how not to do things from the Latin American region, especially with regards to mining and extractives and the management of water resource management, the inclusion of women in the whole process. I mean, there is so much to think about. And I think it is important, if the Southern Africa region is considering this as a way forward, they need to look outside, learn the lessons from other regions that may have a lot of similarities, and most importantly, include your civil society, include communities, that they know their needs, they know what they might need in the future, and their voices need to be included somewhere. Because
the simple fact is that, these natural resources in many cases are a source of conflict, aren't they?
Indeed. And that's the saddest reality of it, and that's where the international community can also play a role in ensuring that you are not trading with things that are illegal, ensuring that, for example, your timber comes from certified sources, that your silver, your gold is exploited in a sustainable and ethical manner. I think that's where all the links of the change can be linked and can be for the benefits of those communities that might be affected.
Okay, Lizzette Robleto-Gonzalez from Progressio, thanks very much indeed for joining us.